Oh boy. Well, we will start this recording and honor folks' time and get going. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this Sunday evening and for tuning into this session whenever or wherever you can access it. My name is Lou Bell Brown, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as superintendent of schools here. And I'm looking forward to this conversation tonight about mental health and well-being in our schools and in our community. And we have an amazing group of panelists today to share some thinking and share some tips with us all. Again, thank you so much. This is an important topic as we're in the midst of several different pandemics, but the health pandemic that we're all facing right now is something that we need to be engaged in conversations about. And tonight is particularly focused on mental health and wellness, as we're seeing an increase in the challenges here locally and throughout our state and country. And I couldn't think of a better group of people to help us figure out how to navigate that than the folks on this call tonight. So we will quickly have folks introduce themselves. Then we will quickly get into the moderated Q&A. My friend Carrie Burke is going to be doing that. And again, if you wish to ask a question of the panelists, click Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Those questions will come into us. And near the end of our session, we're going to do a bit of a lightning round where we're going to just have our panelists answer those questions. So with that, we'll ask Carrie Burke to introduce herself, and then we'll go to Ms. Layton, then Dr. Tammis, and Dr. De Silva. So Carrie, go for it.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Good evening, everyone. I'm so grateful to be with you here this evening to discuss the topics of mental health and well-being. I am the coordinator of health services and wellness for the Ithaca City School District, excuse me. Catherine, go ahead, please introduce yourself.
I'm Catherine Layton. I've been with the Ithaca City School District since 1996. I'm currently in my 10th year at Caroline Elementary School. I have had 2 adult children go through the Ithaca City School District. I'm the primary caretaker of my 87-year-old mother, and I consider myself a champion for children. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation about the mental health of our children in our community.
Hi, I'm Dr. Anna Tunis. I'm a clinical psychologist here in Ithaca. I work primarily on the assessment and diagnosis and designing interventions for kids and teenagers here. I have extensive experience working also as a school psychologist for many years in California, working with kids from preschool all the way through post-secondary. I'm so glad that we're having this conversation tonight. We're at an inflection point in how we manage and deliver care to youth, especially mental health care. So thank you, Dr. Brown. Thank you, Carrie, for organizing this really important panel.
Dr. De Silva, please.
Hi, I'm Audrey De Silva. I'm a pediatrician. I work at Northeast Pediatrics. I've been practicing pediatrics here in Ithaca for over 20 years now. And I am really happy we're having this conversation because I think this pandemic has really brought to bear a lot of concerns about with mental health, both even things that were here before the pandemic that have gotten worse. And so I think it's important that we sort of have this conversation.
Awesome. Like I said, a great
Wonderful.
Group. Go for it, Carrie.
Thank you. So our first topic area, we're going to focus on the pandemic and its impacts on mental health and well-being on children and families. And with that, I would like you to share from your professional perspective, what have you been seeing and hearing in your professional circles around the impact of this pandemic generally on mental health of individuals?
I'll start. We're seeing almost no infectious disease at all, but really we're seeing a tremendous amount of a real increase in depression, anxiety, panic attacks, eating disorders, and informally in conversations with my peers across the country, pediatricians are seeing the same thing everywhere. It's quite distressing.
Within the school setting, what I've been hearing from families and from kids directly is that, especially working with the younger kids at elementary level, is that we really need to be making sure that we're checking in with the adults and staff and community members, the adults around our children, because they're picking up on how the adults are handling the pandemic. So, you know, it's that idea of we need to make sure that we put on our own oxygen masks before we help others. I'm just seeing a lot of stress amongst staff, a lot of stress amongst teachers and families not being sure what is typical behavior versus what is something that might be more pathological. So really making sure that part of this conversation is looking at the caregivers of the children also.
Dr. Tamas, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of what you've seen in your professional practice or learned from your colleagues?
Absolutely. So this past week was one of the first major studies. It was released by Challenge Success, which is an organization out of Stanford University, where they actually got many thousands of teenagers to respond to different surveys and compared how they are doing in the fall of 2020 as opposed to the previous years. And what they found was totally not surprising, that we're seeing a significant decrease in student engagement and learning, which is always a challenge, but it's especially low. We're also seeing that students' relationships with adults and peers are strong in some senses, but very strained in others. And then most importantly, we're seeing that students, especially those who identify as female and students of color, are continuing to experience very high levels of stress and pressure. So those are very significant findings in relation to past years. And so obviously here we're experiencing very similar issues as students are nationally.
Thank you. Now, of course, people are experiencing a whole range of emotions and concerns with this pandemic. And I think one thing that might be difficult for individuals is figuring out what's a healthy or sort of normal response with things like isolation, and then what's concerning. What is something that would push someone into needing professional support and intervention?
Did I go first? So I guess, I mean, this is such a big question. We're really looking for caregivers and teachers to really be knowledgeable about what the normal feelings of helplessness and hopelessness are that we're all experiencing in this as a reaction to this pandemic versus what is clinically significant. So we're looking for clinically significant changes in patterns of sleep, pattern in diet, exercise, engagement with friends, with academics, loss of interest, and all of those types of issues are really important patterns to be looking for. But as a provider, I'm always wanting parents and caregivers to call anytime that they see any kind of difference or change, because we can always work through that together. And there's so many things we can do to prevent a further exacerbation of those symptoms. So it's really complex in how we're all responding to this prolonged, we're all in this exhaustion phase of this stress response to the pandemic versus what would actually be diagnosable and
Dr. De Silva, in your practice where you're seeing pediatric patients, how are you discerning between those who are experiencing something that might be very normal, under the auspices of this pandemic, and something that is more concerning and requires your attention?
I think the first thing I ask either the parents, if the kids are younger, or the teens themselves, is how much do they feel that what they're experiencing is actually interfering with their functioning. So, if they're not sleeping quite as well, but they're still getting enough sleep, that's okay. But if they can't fall asleep and it's affecting their ability to get up in the morning, if they're having periods of crying, but they're still hanging out with friends and doing things and having fun, I'm not so worried. But if the sadness is enough that they don't want to be with their friends or don't want to be with their family, that's more concerning. So I mean, it's on a spectrum, I think, and for me, the inflection point is when it begins to interfere, and that's a little different for each kid.
And just to go off something that Anna said, you know, within the schools, we're really doing kind of this reaching out to all of our families to check in so that families don't feel like they have to wait until it's a more serious problem. So, you know, call when you feel like your child is restless. Don't wait until you're worried that they might have ADHD, or call when you think that they're just a little sad. Don't wait until they're depressed. Call when they're feeling a little bit worried about something and it hasn't been let go until they've gotten to a point of feeling anxious. So this idea of having a dialogue and making sure that we have those open channels of communication so that families do know that they can reach out before it feels like it's a critical moment.
I'm going to go back to this topic of things that we're seeing in terms of trends. I think nationally there's been a conversation about increased hospitalizations of pediatric and adolescent patients. And Dr. De Silva, you mentioned eating disorders. Are these things that we're seeing in our own community? Are you aware of those trends being manifest here as well?
Sorry, I don't have hard data from our community, but certainly anecdotally, it does feel like there are more eating disorders, there are more hospitalizations. It feels like there was a baseline, and the pandemic over the course, especially since, in my perspective, from like December or January, things have really just like everything's been pushed up pretty dramatically. So yes, I think I'm seeing it, but I don't have hard data.
Catherine or Dr. Hammond, have you seen any change in referral patterns to yourselves for concerns among children that might differ from what you see in previous years?
I can speak a little bit to that. I have to say, in March, when we went from, you know, being full capacity to all of a sudden we're not going back to school, our model changed. So we kind of became incredibly flexible with services and outreach, and decided that everybody in the in our community needed a check-in. So you didn't have to have the bureaucracy of we need a referral to be able to get the phone call, to be able to get the services. We kind of got rid of all of that and just kind of wrapped around at least our community within the Caroline School. So, you know, I would say that that was a benefit, that we got rid of that bureaucratic piece. And so we don't really have that data of are there more referrals or not, because at this point we're really trying to provide outreach and support to all of our families, because we don't want to end up overlooking somebody who may need help and just don't know how to ask for it.
Yeah, and I would just add, especially for our secondary students, I'm having, you know, just caregivers just sound and seem just much more desperate, you know, that we just don't have the same circles of support that we're used to, and we don't have those sort of informal check-ins with our friends and neighbors and extended families that we're used to having, you know, whether it's on a sports field or, you know, in a church service. We're just not having those sort of more informal supports. And so I'm getting the sense, especially like Dr. De Silva said, this year, this winter, starting actually in December, that just people just feel more lonely and alone and just are really just more desperate for help for their families, which is a typical reaction to, I feel like, the state that we're experiencing now.
Thank you. I'd like to drill down a little bit on some communities of interest around this, because we know that the COVID experience has been disproportionate. And I want to know more about your insights or experience with respect to mental health for communities of color, because they have, the impact of COVID has been disproportionate on them. They've experienced higher cases and higher rates of death. And so can you speak to, in your experience or observations, either locally or nationally, what we know about mental health in communities of color.
So we know that with disproportionate rates of COVID in communities of color, we're experiencing the same situation with mental health. We know that access to mental health services in communities of color is much less. We know that people who identify as people of color have a much higher rate of actually being diagnosed with a mental health disorder. We know all of those inequities exist, and COVID has just really highlighted all of that for us in plain sight. So it is our responsibility as providers to address this, and I'm hoping we can talk more either tonight or later about ways that we can increase access, especially here in this county, for all of our students, in ways where we can really coordinate care so that we don't have to echo these national trends, and that we can really increase access to everyone who needs it.
And just to go along with what Anna's saying, as she was saying, even pre-pandemic, we already knew that these inequities existed, and they exist in the Ithaca area also. And it's not just about creating better access. It's about really looking at our service delivery model. What do those services look like? Are we going into the community, or are our expectations that the community comes to us when we're talking about services? So I agree that I'm really excited about having conversation around the inequities that have been just more exposed through the pandemic, and how we can really look at access and delivery.
I'd add to that Dr. Brown mentioned there's more than one pandemic happening right now, and so our families of color are dealing with more than just COVID. They're dealing with, these children are dealing with all the stressors of the racial inequities and injustice that are more apparent, and they're hearing on the news, and I think that has also been really difficult. It has just magnified all the other stressors that our communities are dealing with.
I do also want to acknowledge that it's exposed resilience as well, because I've worked with some families of color who are telling me, I know how to access some of this because I've had to do it on a monthly basis anyway. I know how to get unemployment because I've had to do this. I've lost a job before, so I also want to acknowledge the strength and the resilience of our communities of color as well. And what an amazing resource that our families can be for us understanding the system better as well.
Thank you. And I think that provides a nice shift to discussing the impact of this pandemic on your practice. And so in response to the needs of our community, the communities that you serve, and of course the health and safety requirements of this pandemic, how has that shifted your practice?
I'll start with it. So one of the things that the pandemic has done, which has actually been, at least in medicine, a really helpful tool, is given us telemedicine, and that has allowed us to access, or allowed our families and patients to access care that often I don't think they would have been able to access. I've had appointments with students like in the hallway of the high school, during their haircut appointment, in the car driving somewhere. So often, kids who couldn't make the appointment now can meet with us. Like I said earlier, we're seeing very little typical pediatric care. Much more of our efforts and appointments are going towards mental health care. We now have a behavioral health specialist in our practice, and I think that's becoming much more of a standard to sort of provide at least bridging counseling for families that are in crisis if they can't get in to see sort of for connect with a community therapist. Yeah, I think, but we're all screening families for stress and mental health concerns much more carefully than we used to.
So I primarily do psychological and neuropsychological assessments, which entail many hours of work with kids and teenagers, usually spread out over many sessions. And so because of the vaccine and because of all these protocols that have worked, I'm going to be working in person with students starting next week. So that's really exciting. But in terms of access, it's just been so great to be able to work with parents, caregivers outside of the office setting, because just like you said, Dr. Silva, it's just I'm just finding that it's just so much easier to connect this way. And I find that it can be very authentic too with adults. With students, obviously, and especially with young children, it's imperative that we get back to seeing them in person, because we can't do the work over the screen like we can with adults. And I think that holds true in the schools as well. So I'm just so looking forward to getting back into the office with my young people. So I think some of these changes with enabling caregivers to work with us remotely is going to absolutely stick, because it does just enable us, so we save so much time and it's just so much more efficient. So I think those things will stay.
I agree with that piece as well, especially for the families and caregivers, especially as a school personnel, is really being able to have more access to doing some of the family work. For me, it's completely shifting my practice. When I first started in social work, really it was grassroots, macro. If a student didn't attend school, we were getting in our cars and going into the community. And we kind of moved to a more medical model where we were seeing students more individually. And I think we need to go back to that more community-based model, and not waiting for intervention, but really providing intervention and education. And, in 2018, as part of the health curriculum, it became mandated that we do a mental health curriculum as well. And I'd like to rejuvenate that health curriculum and the mental health curriculum, especially in the younger grades. We tend to kind of leave that for the spring, and we just need to make sure that we're doing this early education. And like I said, trying to move away from that more medical model of individual students and one-to-one sessions, and open up to really providing more groups and more full class lessons, and getting that family piece. The family engagement piece, I think, is really important, so that the parents know what we're doing supporting their children in the schools, that they also get that level of support from us as school personnel. I mean, I think the changes are exciting that are ahead of us.
It's good to hear that some positive things have emerged from this pandemic, in that it sounds like access has improved. It's prompted practitioners to rethink the way that they engage with their pediatric clients or patients, as well as the families. Are there things you see emerging from that you would like to continue beyond this time period, post-COVID? Are there practices and things that you think have done made such improvements or adjustments or increased access that you want them to persist?
We've got lots of things that we want to continue. For one, we are definitely planning on expanding our behavioral health, like the embedded behavioral health in the practice. And I think that's universal amongst practices, because it's clear that care and mental health care are so closely entwined with each other. I think that we are going to continue to spend, we used to just screen for medical problems when people came in, milestones, things like that. I think we're now pretty routinely, and will continue to routinely do a lot more screening for mental health concerns, focus issues, things like that. Oh, and telemedicine. We will continue telemedicine for sure.
I was just about to ask about that. Is telehealth, is telemedicine here to stay? It sounds like it is. Excellent. So this, our last area of focus is really around mitigating mental health issues and supporting well-being at the individual, family, and organizational level. And I want to preface this portion of the conversation by saying that the advice and recommendations shared here are not a substitute for professional mental health support. So if you or someone you love is experiencing a concern, please reach out. We will talk about how and where to go for help and assistance, but just be aware that the things discussed here are not designed to attend to your individual concerns, and it's not a substitute for the services of a mental health professional. So with that, what can we tell our audience about how they might best monitor their mental health or the mental health of their loved ones?
I mean, one of the things that we need to be talking to each other. We need to be asking each other how we're doing. We need to be doing periodic check-ins, not just waiting for concerning signs. I think it was spoken to, it might have been Dr. De Silva who brought it up earlier, like just the idea that, yeah, we need to be doing regular check-ins and talking. And then if you see like those distressing signs that it's become something that is impacting your ability to do a typical day, that becomes more concerning. And that's when you should be seeking more specific supports. But even with the young kids, you know, I think sometimes we don't realize that we really need to be checking in with the youngest of our kids. You know, before this panel, I actually talked to a few of my students and I was asking them how they were doing, and they'll tell you if you ask them. And there's some things for some kids that are working very well. You know, there's some kids who were having social difficulties in school and they're not occurring anymore because they're not in our school buildings. To me, that means we need to look at that. Why was it that there were these social stressors in our buildings for certain students? But I think it has to start with us having dialogue and conversation and checking in with each other.
One of the things I've been trying to sort of talk to families about is, and maybe this is a simplistic way of looking at it, that, you know, we all have our emotional batteries, and the pandemic is causing those batteries to drain really quickly because there's a lot of stressors. And so, and at the same time, it is especially for the older kids, essentially stopped the input of energy, like they're not social, all the things that kids need to sort of rebuild that battery, their socialization, you know, playing sports with their friends, things like that are down to a trickle. So in terms of sort of helping prevent children from really hitting the bottom of their batteries, you know, minimizing the stressors on one end, and then on the other end, working to help them find things that will sort of recharge their batteries, you know, and in-person socialization is so critical for kids. You know, so get them outside, take walks, you know, with masks on. There's things they can do to actually see each other besides talking on Zoom, you know, and then the standard things, maximizing sleep, making sure you're eating 3 meals a day, getting exercise, all those other things that kind of help recharge you and help them find things that give them joy. Because the things that normally work, we can't count on right now. So.
I think it's also part of the conversation to have is that we're normalizing mental health care and that we're recognizing that we all have periods of time in our lives that we need mental health support, such as now, most of us do, and having those open and honest conversations with our children, with our students, with our teachers, and making it a very, very typical part of a check-in with someone, I think will go a long way. And just sort of realizing what strong mental health is, which is different from good physical health. You know, strong mental health means about learning how to have big emotions and cope with those and be okay when things are not okay. And so just having those really open conversations with each other, with our neighbors, with our elders, with all of the people in our circle, I think can go a long way to helping us all feel more supported because so many, just like what Dr. De Silva just said, so many of our natural supports are not available.
And I'm probably just stating the obvious, but from what Dr. De Silva said and Anna just shared, I mean, we're really talking about education and the need for education, not just during a critical moment. It's hard to learn the skills that we're talking about when you're under stress already. So that's why it's so important that we really look at making sure that this is education that's going from when kids are in pre-K all the way up, so that they have these resources when they need to call upon them, when they need to recharge that battery. You know, you can teach very early on for children that feelings aren't facts. They don't have to stay static, and you don't have to wait for something external from you to change it, right? Like, we need to be teaching that early on, so that when we find ourselves in a stressful situation, we can call upon those resources. It's really challenging to teach that while students and children are in a stressed situation.
We haven't talked much at this point yet about social media. I think the panelists recognize that social media has probably been a lifeline for many young people, particularly adolescents, because that's how they connect with each other. That's how they create community. But I think we're also well aware of the potential downsides of social media, particularly spending a lot of time. What, if anything, have you been counseling families in adolescents on with respect to social media?
I'll just say something briefly about needing to speak to the adults and caregivers as well about social media, because there are a lot of forums and a lot of information out there. And I feel like, you know, I'm dealing with working with a lot of caregivers and families who are trying to weed through the social media themselves to figure out, you know, what is correct information and not. So I think it's for the students as well as the caregivers and adults to try to figure out this social media piece.
I always refer families to commonsensemedia.org, which I feel provides amazing resources and answers a ton of questions, and sort of takes the caregiver out of the equation so that the tween or the teen can sort of see for themselves what the research shows. I think that is a key piece, so that the student can really make an informed decision. I love the use of social media and media contracts within a family to define rules around what are device-free spaces, when are devices available, when are devices allowed, when are devices done for the night, etc. I feel like those kinds of contracts can be really powerful. But of course, all families choose different rules. And so that is also really complicated, and we're all figuring this out. But as someone who has a tween and teen in the house, it is a never-ending discussion. It is a constant piece of our family meetings and our family talks. And I feel like it has to be, because it is in the forefront of all of our lives. So it's complicated.
I'd also add, I mean, I think a lot of the things that we talk about with social media pre-pandemic still hold during the pandemic. I mean, absolutely, kids, like it is a lifeline for socializing, but it's not. I mean, I worry about kids spending all of their time online, and that, you know, the sunlight, fresh air is really important. It's not a cliche. And actually, I've been reading some stuff recently that because we aren't seeing sun, like kids are going from their bedrooms straight to the computer screens in the morning, they're not actually, like their brain's circadian rhythms are getting messed up. And so that just increases the difficulty with sleeping. And so, I mean, it is really important to get kids off of their screens and outside, like not just off the screens, but off their screens and outside, so that their brains, you know, so that your circadian rhythms actually know day and night. Yeah.
There's definitely the physiological impact of overuse, but also for me in my practice, I feel a lot that it's not what the kids are necessarily doing online that's the problem. It's just that what they would be doing instead of spending that time on their screens that they're missing out on. And then we're seeing actual deficits in development because of these hours logged on the screen. So they're missing the social interactions, they're missing the just experience of boredom, they're missing the potential for creativity. So those are just some of the things that are happening when kids are on the devices, not necessarily doing anything wrong or inappropriate, but they need to be, just monitored so the time is well spent.
Also, just in terms of media in general for the younger, I tend to be focused on the elementary age kids as families and caregivers having an awareness of what media kids are overhearing. So if a television is on or a radio is on, some kids are hearing things that they don't know how to process that information, the younger kids. So just having an awareness of what the kids are being exposed to potentially indirectly is really important to be monitoring as well.
Thank you. And with that, I think, to your point, kids are keenly aware of what's happening in the environment around them and the conversations that are happening. So how do parents talk to children about coronavirus without introducing undue fear and anxiety? How do they talk to them about it? And what are some good sources of information for families and caregivers to access?
So just some real basic sort of nuggets for caregivers are to share, age appropriate information. So not to overshare things that may not be appropriate for younger children would be really important. And then also to correct misinformation, because just like Catherine said, kids are hearing so much about COVID if they're going to school in person, from media, they could be reading things. So it's a chance to correct misinformation. And then I think the next really important thing is to reassure kids, teens as well as young kids, that they're safe, that all of the things that we've been doing, all of our mitigating factors, like, washing their hands every hour, said my 9-year-old, or, wearing the double mask and doing all of these things are working. And so that, kids can feel secure and safe because they're able to do those things. And then also just sort of this sort of bigger point that there's so many amazing grown-ups just like you who are working so hard to prevent COVID from becoming, spreading more, and we're trying to cure it. And so there's so many people who are spending time doing those things that they can take assurance that they feel that they belong and that they have the accurate information, because we certainly don't want to be hiding information or pretending that things are okay when they're not.
So with that, where do people go for help? If they don't have a connection to a mental health provider, how do they begin this process? Where can they go to find out if they're eligible for services or how to access services? Are there starting points you can share with folks here that people can access and look at?
So on the school level, we are really privileged to have social workers and psychologists in our buildings. It's a great resource. It's a great starting place. School counselors as well. That's a good place to start because they have some connection with outside resources and can help kind of, steer families in the right direction. So, my hope would be that would be a great starting place for our families.
And you can also, approach your pediatrician's office or your family practice office. We also are in connection with the schools, with resources in the community. Most of the practices here now have embedded behavioral health support in their offices as well.
One of the things we were talking about before the panel officially started this evening was that we all are aware that there are wait lists still, and that there are still issues of access. And, I think that to all of our point, and I think, Anna, you've been probably the clearest about it, is we need to have a conversation about how to how to remedy that, you know, how to get more services, get the access to be up for families, and try to figure this out. If it's creating peer-to-peer groups so that families are together receiving services, something so that, you know, families don't feel discouraged by, okay, I've reached out and now I'm on a wait list for 6 months. You know, so I think that that's going to be conversation, continued conversation.
Absolutely. I think that we're at a real inflection point in how we can talk about delivery and access and just appropriate models of care that are going to work for different kinds of needs and different kinds of people. So I think this is a much larger conversation that I think a lot of us are ready to engage in. So I'm looking forward to that.
I appreciate those comments, and I think that's a good place to take us for the end of this conversation is, you know, the pandemic has prompted a lot of reflection on our systems and our policies, which we once presumed to be best practice. I know we in the district have been thinking very differently about a whole slew of things, everything from grading to attendance and otherwise. So based on your own experience, what changes would you like to see in terms of policy and organizational or professional practice? What things are you going to advocate for within your own organization and maybe beyond that, you know, at the state or national level?
We certainly are going to be advocating, and I know the American Academy of Pediatrics is advocating for much more comprehensive mental health coverage. And you know, one of it was mentioned before, but it is a real issue. We do not have enough resources right now. There just aren't enough therapists in the community to manage the stress on the system. So I mean, that's definitely something we'll be working.
And it would be just amazing to be able to coordinate our medical needs and our mental health needs, perhaps at the school setting, in the school setting.
Yeah.
We could work remotely with caregivers, so we could work in person with students, so that we can, as mental health and medical providers in the community, work with school support teams and figure out what that would look like. This has been done many places across the country, and I think here we have this very cohesive county that can work together to figure out some kind of funding stream that may be separate from insurance based, so we could really meet the needs. And it's going to be especially important as kids return to, you know, full in-school instruction, hopefully sooner rather than later, that we have something set up where we can really try to get ahead of the need, because we know that it's so significant.
And I believe that we are really resource rich in our community. So, you know, we're all working very hard. Are we working as efficiently as we could? You know, like, so I think that I have this need to be a little bit more curious about what the resources are and how we are implementing them, and why are there such they're like a long list of questions that I have before really making big changes. But even within the schools, you know, and I know that I have the ITA to keep in mind also, but, you know, some flexibility with when we give what services, and just being a little bit more flexible in our service delivery model, because we do have a lot of resources here. I mean, we can go into other communities where there's nothing. I'm curious about that. And I think that we can, by working together, getting more to that grassroots model of community-based servicing, we can get there, and we can reach more families.
Thank you for that. I'm so grateful for all of you for your insights and for sharing your expertise. Dr. Brown, would you like to close our session this evening?
Well, I'm just happy I can stop typing. I've been taking so many notes here. My hands are cramping up. My fingers. I learned so much from you all. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your service to this wonderful community that we all live and work in. We've all learned much today. You answered some tough questions that are all on our minds and hearts. Just thank you for this. And for the folks who tuned in tonight and who will tune in later, please continue to send us your thoughts your suggestions, your recommendations, your questions. We're in this thing together. And just by an indication of the amazing people on this call tonight, we can do some amazing things for our young people and community if we work together. So again, thank you all. We're right on time. I wish you all a great Sunday evening, and we will see you again next time. Thank you.
Thank you.